I'm now going to continue my video series on Henry Ward Beecher and his sermons by discussing Matthew chapter 18 verses 6 through 7. The first thing I'm going to do is define a couple of terms for you. So what was the millstone that Jesus was referring to? I'm going to post a hyperlink in the description below. It will show you a picture of the type of millstone Jesus was referring to. Now think about this for a second. Jesus was not referring to a millstone that was so large that it would emulate a monster truck tire. Okay, you've seen the monster trucks, you've seen their tires. That millstone was not that big. How could you fit a millstone that size around a man's neck? It didn't work that way. Okay? Not everything that's super heavy is super large. Work in retail sometime and you'll figure that out real quick. Alright. Now, who was the child? Well, it doesn't specifically say, but you can infer some of this just by where Jesus was at. Where was Jesus when he was teaching this? He was in Galilee. And this child certainly was not the child of a Pharisee, or a Sadducee, or a king, or a prince, or a politician. That child was none of those. Okay? This child was the child of a poor person. Most likely, this was an orphan. So this was a great big offense to Jesus. Anybody that offended a child like that ticked Jesus off. Alright? And why? Because that orphan may not stay an orphan forever. Remember, God controls that orphan's life. Okay? Now, a lot of people try to stop that, but God, if He has a purpose for that child, He's going to make sure that child fulfills that purpose. Okay. Now, let me give you some examples here. Let's think about Moses for a second. Did Jesus view Moses as inferior? Not worthy of good treatment, that kind of thing? No. Jesus never thought badly of Moses because he was adopted. What about Johann Sebastian Bach? That guy was orphaned at age 9. He was born in 1685 and his parents died in 1695. Look what Sebastian Bach became. Mention that name in the music world and see what happens. But there are other orphans that are a little closer to home. Try this one on. Steve Jobs. He was born in 1955. Look what he became. If it wasn't for him, you wouldn't have the iPad, the iPod, the iPhone, or any Apple product whatsoever. Even iTunes, you wouldn't even have that. So just because you see an orphan today and you don't think much of him now, think about what he will eventually become. But it gets better. How about John Lennon? There was an orphan. Well, look at the success he had. And how about Carol Burnett? Born in 1933, raised by her grandmother. Look what happened to her. An orphan back then could become somebody later on. So you don't want to offend this orphan, because you don't know what this orphan's going to become. But let's discuss a couple of other people. People that would definitely take you by surprise. Lee Marvin. You've heard of him. He starred in The Dirty Dozen. He was one of the big stars. Do you know he was actually a military man in World War II? That's right. He was actually in World War II. He served in World War II. And guess who his sergeant was? None other than the guy who played Captain Kangaroo on television. No kidding. And what about Fred Rogers? That was a guy who served in Vietnam. You know why he wore all those sweaters? Mainly because he had so many tattoos on his arms, he didn't want little kids to see them. He went from an absolute nobody to a complete success. These are not the kind of people you want to offend. Now, when it comes to child rearing, if God blesses you enough to give you a child or a lot of children, there are two extremes you can go with this. You can either become a dictator, like Adolf Hitler, or you become super indulgent. And if you become super indulgent, that kid may become a Minnie the Moocher. And if you've ever seen the movie Arthur, well, enough said right there. Watch the movie Arthur. You'll get an idea of what happens when you indulge the kid too much. So you don't want to be a massive dictator to the kids, because you know what happened in World War II? Kids started turning their parents in. And part of the reason why they did that is because they had overbearing parents. They didn't feel any love for their parents, so they say, hey, go ship them off. So that's one extreme. And then you have the other extreme, which the kids were being indulged so much that they turned out to be people like Arthur. So you have to find a proper balance so you don't ruin your kids. See what I mean? Let me tell you something. Parents can spank their children without it being child abuse. It really can happen. You just have to find the right way to do it. Okay? You don't have to draw blood when you smack a kid on the rear. No need of that. You can smack a kid on the rear and 5 seconds later he can sit on a chair and he'd be perfectly fine. You don't have to go to extremes with punishment. You know how they used to say, just a little bit will do you well? There you go. So, just keep that in mind. If you raise a child correctly, he will bring you great honor. Otherwise, he's going to sit in a jail cell or a homeless shelter, or worse, a pine box. And I don't think you want that to happen. Okay. Now also keep in mind that the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is the servant of all. I'm sorry to say that there are employers out there who don't think that way. They do everything they can to take advantage of their employees. They'll pour tons of work on them, but not give them proper compensation for it. Doesn't that sound a little familiar? Doesn't that sound like what the Egyptians used to do to the Israelites before Moses came along? You saw how that one worked out. Okay. Now then. But it's not just little kids that Jesus was talking about in that verse. Let's put you into a couple scenarios. Okay. Let's say you have a high school senior, and this guy ingests intoxicating substances on a regular basis. He shouldn't be, but he is. Okay? And then he influences an underclassman to do the same thing. You know what God does to that high school senior that influenced that underclassman to also ingest intoxicating substances on a regular basis? He says to that high school senior, he says, look, it would be better that you took a millstone and you tied it around your neck and throw yourself in a river than to come face to face with me over this. He says that. Let's take a hypothetical example of two military soldiers. One seasoned, one just a newbie. A newly enlisted guy. Now the seasoned soldier, he knows how to gamble. But he knows how to do it in a way that doesn't influence his life. He can take a loss just as much as he can take a win. But he teaches the newly enlisted guy how to gamble. Well, the newly enlisted guy can't handle monetary loss. So the newly enlisted guy eventually becomes destitute and maybe even a criminal, all because the seasoned soldier taught him how to gamble. You know what God says to that seasoned soldier? He says it would be better that you tied a millstone around your neck and throw yourself into a river than to come face to face with me with this enlisted guy. That's what he says. Okay? And this is the same thing you found in the book of Acts. Paul had to write a letter about this. Not kidding you. Because there was a Christian church, and the seasoned people in that Christian church were going to meat markets and buying meat that had been sacrificed to pagan gods. And were eating it in front of the newbie Christians and saying, hey, look, we can eat this meat all we want. God won't strike us down for this. Well, what was happening was that these newly enlisted Christians would then go to that same meat market, buy this sacrificed meat, and were then getting influenced by the guy who owned the meat market. And eventually these newbie Christians were falling back into paganism. And Paul says, stop it. You don't understand. If you want to buy that meat and you want to eat it at home, you go right ahead. But don't eat that meat in front of these people, because you're causing them to turn back to paganism. They don't understand what you understand. And it's going to take time to educate them. And if you cause any of them to go back to paganism, God says to you, Jesus says to you, it would be better that you tied a millstone around your neck and threw yourself in a river than to face me with this. You know who should have had a millstone put around their necks? Jim Jones, David Koresh, the guy that was the leader of that Hale-Bopp comet. They should have had millstones around their necks because of the influences they were putting on these people that caused them to do what they did. And God will judge them all. He'll even judge Adolf Hitler for deceiving so many Germans. It would have been better that Adolf Hitler had put a millstone around his neck and drowned himself in a river than to face God the way he's going to face him one of these days. That's a fact. Okay. But it goes on. Let's think about this for a second. Unfortunately, there are used car salesmen in the world that will do everything they can to defraud their customers. Not everybody's like this, but there are those that will. And you know what God says to them? He says it would be better that you tied a millstone around your neck and poured yourself into a river, just throwing yourself in, than to face me with the way you defrauded these people, because you may have put these people in harm's way. Maybe there was something defective on the used car and you knew about it, you didn't tell them, so these people drove your car and got into a wreck because of it. Maybe even perished because of it. How will you feel then? Pretty bad. Okay. And yes, there are merchants in the world that do what they can to defraud their customers. And it's not just in used car sales. It's all over the place. Okay? But the thing is that sometimes it's the customers themselves that drive the merchants to do that. Yeah, sometimes it's the customers that cause these merchants to overvalue their merchandise so they can get what they need to get. Think about the customers we're talking about here. These are the customers that will use every coupon in the book and will even go as far as to use a tax deduction to get what they want without paying for it. You know what that's called in God's book? That's called stealing. And unfortunately, there are Christians that do this, not even realizing that they're doing something wrong. You know what happens when you as a Christian try to buy merchandise for people you want to donate to. Say you want to buy merchandise for a church, or merchandise for the homeless, or merchandise for people that are sad or lonely or whatever. You think you're really helping them out by getting this ton of merchandise, but you really didn't really pay for it. You used tons of coupons and a tax deduction on top of it. You know what you're doing? You're getting the merchant involved in your donations, and you're also getting the government involved in your donations. Jesus had an answer for that. Do you know why Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God"? I'll tell you why. Do you know what those Roman coins were all about? If you looked on them, they had pictures of pagan gods on them. The message Jesus was giving? Give the pagans back their pagan gods. They don't belong to you. When you make a donation, you make the donation. Don't get the government involved in your donation, and certainly do not get the merchant involved in your donation. You make the donation. And you know why it's said that way? Here's the reason. Because God is saying, the message I want you to send out is that I provide you enough that you can make this donation. You see this on Black Friday every year. I'm not kidding you. You will see tons of people, and I'm sorry to say there are Christians that do this. They will go into the stores, risk their lives, risk their cars to get some expensive gift without paying the expensive price. And God says, look, it doesn't count. Not in my books. If you really love that person, you would pay a decent price for that merchandise. You would pay what it's really worth. Now, no, you don't want to get overcharged. That's true. You want to do a little bartering, but not to the extreme that you're getting a ton of merchandise and you're not really paying for it. Because what you're in essence saying when you do that, when you do such massive couponing and you use all these tax deductions on top of it, what you're saying is that God cannot provide you enough to get the merchandise. Oh yes, God can. You tell God what you want to get done, and if God wants you to do that, He'll make sure you have enough and overflowing so you can get the job done. See what I mean? Now, sometimes what drives people to do extreme couponing and tax deductions is this. They get tons of peer pressure. And I'm sad to say that there are some churches that do this. They give you massive amounts of peer pressure. You don't look right. You don't act right. You don't have the right car. You don't have the right house. You should never, ever get bling to appease those kind of people. You know why? Because one day they're going to go up to the throne of God. And you know what God's going to say to them? You know what Jesus is going to say? He's going to say, to those of you who delivered that much peer pressure to all those people, unjustifiably, to those of you who did all that peer pressure, it would have been better if you'd have tied a millstone around your neck to jump in the river and drowned yourself than to be in front of me right now. He'll say that word for word. Now, this is where I differ a little bit from Henry Ward Beecher. Can you get the bling? Well, if God allows you, and as long as you do not lose your relationship to God, and you are not trying to get the bling to appease the people that are pouring this peer pressure on you, yes, you can. And watching my videos and getting educated is a good thing. And it will get you in a higher paying position. And then you can get some of this bling. So if it is not to appease, if the reason you're getting the bling is not to appease those that are pouring peer pressure on you, then why do you do it? You do it to defy these people. You don't do it to appease them. You do it to defy them. You say, I got this bling for myself. I didn't get it for you. I got it because I wanted it. Had nothing to do with you whatsoever. You were not even a part of the decision. See what I mean? Another reason you get the bling is so that you can share the bling with those that are less fortunate than yourself. Help build up their self-esteem. Say, look, I'm going to have two ladies. One that's a little more fortunate, one that's a little less. And you take the little less lady and you say, look, we've been friends for years. We're going to go shopping together. We're both going to get dresses. I will pay for them because I want us both to look good. Has nothing to do with anybody else. I just want both of us to look good. Not for any particular reason. We just want to look good. And you share it. Or for guys, say, look, I'm going to have this cookout on this nice grill for everybody because I don't want to eat alone. So I got this extra bling so we could all share in the meal together. I didn't do it to satisfy peer pressure. I bought this nice 2-story house not to satisfy peer pressure, but so I would have enough room to entertain guests because I don't want to be alone. That's a better reason to get bling. But you do it in God's timing, and you do it through education. You don't steal from people. You don't defraud people. You do it by God's instruction and through education. And you do it for yourself. Never for peer pressure. Never. It doesn't matter what they think of you. You do it for you and not for anybody else. Okay? Now remember, consumers, when you stand there and you use all those coupons and you use all those tax deductions, you know what you do? You may end up putting the merchant out of business. And then when he's not there for you anymore, where are you going to get your stuff? And I see this far too often with small businesses. How many small businesses have disappeared because they had customers that constantly defrauded them? Think about that. You want to do a fair bartering. Okay, there's a difference between doing a fair bartering and then absolutely outright trying to rip somebody off. Learn the difference. Learn to pay a reasonable price. Not an exorbitant price. And not an undercut price, but a reasonable price. You pay for what you really should get. And don't worry about your money because it comes from God. Okay? God has sent through me the education you need to get the money that you should have. But you can't lose your relationship with God while you learn all this stuff. Being smarter does not make you a better person. Ask Adolf Hitler, you'll find out. And being richer doesn't make you a better person either. I think we covered that a few videos ago when I talked about all those rich people like Charles Schwab. They were rich, they weren't any better. You could be a rich person and be in a good relationship with God. You could be a smart person and be in a good relationship with God. God has to be the core of your education. God likes educated people. That's why he had Peter. Peter was a fisherman. He knew the fisherman's marketplace. He knew how to sail a ship. He knew how to catch fish. Matthew, tax collector. He knew the whole tax collecting system. He could read, he could write, and he could do arithmetic. So God likes smart people. But being smart and being rich doesn't make you any better. There's too much proof of that. Alright, so when you try to obtain the bling, you obtain it through education without losing your relationship to God. Let me say that again. You get your bling through the education without losing your relationship to God, and you let God show you the way to do it without offending Him. Okay? Let God guide your path. Let God guide your education. You learn on God's timetable, not on the world's timetable. Just because I give you the ability to learn faster doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to make you a better person. Okay? And just because you get the bling doesn't necessarily make you a better person. And don't forget those that are coming up behind you. You share your bling. If you get the bling, you share it with them. That way greed does not corrupt your heart, and it doesn't destroy you. So, you can do bartering without stealing and without paying too much. You let God tell you what price you should pay. And you let God show you how to get the resources in the right manner. Okay? It's basically letting God guide your life. Don't be a cheapskate. Don't ever pay too much. And let God tell you how much you should pay. Don't listen to yourself. You listen to God. God will tell you how much you should pay. That's the way it works. Anyway, hopefully you're not too confused by all this. Just remember, if God gives you the chance to raise children, do not corrupt them with dictatorship or overindulgence. Don't be like the guy who's a senior in high school and influences people to start doing drugs. Don't be like the seasoned military soldier that teaches somebody how to gamble and causes them to ruin their lives. Don't be that person. Don't be the defrauder on the merchant end, and don't be the defrauding customer on the customer end. Alright. And if you get bling, you get it through God. You get it through education. And don't ever get bling because of peer pressure. You get it to defy peer pressure. You don't get it for peer pressure. You don't appease these people. You defy them. That's the difference. Alright. I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.